Welcome everybody to this second day of the International Symposium, Governance and Anti-Doping, How to Meet the Challenges. Yesterday we had a brief but very intense day with loads of information and a focus on several dimensions of governance of anti-doping. Among other things, we discussed how to best protect the independence of national agencies and prevent conflicts of interest. If you still have not downloaded the handout, or if you did not take part yesterday, you should know that in the menu you will find a handout tool, and you can download 2 PDF files, one with many of the proceedings of yesterday, the slides that were presented, and one with the NADGO tool, the National Anti-Doping Governance Observer tool, which allows you to benchmark your own anti-doping agency. Today we will focus on two of the themes that were also highlighted often yesterday: the role of athletes, their influence in the governance of anti-doping. Should they have influence? And if yes, in which way and in which areas of anti-doping? Later, we will also discuss the governance of the World Anti-Doping Agency, the global regulator about doping, because governance issues there also come up regularly in the international public debate. But first, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Jens Sejer Andersen. I'm the International Director of Play the Game, who acts as the coordinator of this project. However, with very active partners, Play the Game would never have been able to do much of this alone, if anything. But among other things, the partners NADO and NADA Germany are the ones who arrange the technical setup and all the pomp and circumstances around this digital symposium. And I have been handed over some housekeeping remarks that I hope will be useful for you. First of all, you should know that all sessions will be recorded, and we will try to put them at your disposal on demand at some point after the conference. The GoToMeeting software should be self-explaining, but just add that you can enlarge windows, in particular for a better view. You should also know, as an attendee, your microphone is muted and your camera is offline. Nevertheless, we encourage you to ask questions. There are sessions designated for that, and you can use the question function, which is a kind of chat function for, and the organizers will then provide your question to the moderator of the session. One very important thing when you ask questions, please indicate your name, and if you come from an organization, please also indicate that, followed by your question. We collect the questions. We will deal with them afterwards if we cannot answer to all questions in this short time frame we have, but we will really do our best to ensure that no question will be neglected. If you have technical problems, please also use the question function. We will try to give online support. We have a group of supporters in Bonn, and after the symposium is finished, you will receive a feedback questionnaire, which we hope you will fill in. That will help us a lot in the work with this project and also for future events. Now it's my pleasure to turn to the substance of today, or one of the issues, and chairing the next session is Rob Koehler, who was for 17 years the Deputy Director General of the World Anti-Doping Agency, and since he left then, he has become Director of an athlete interest organization, the Global Athlete. Rob Koehler, I will leave the presentation of the panel to you, and wish you good luck in the next little hour.
Thank you, Jens. First, I just wanted to thank the researchers, the partners, the Erasmus Plus program for their support. I think this has been an incredibly important project and highlights the need for enhanced governance in anti-doping. Also like to thank NADO Germany and NADO for hosting the meeting. It would have been nice to be together in person, but in the reality of today's time, we will stick with the online version. I think it's also important to recognize and thank Play the Game, because one of the things that we have experienced with Play the Game in the past, and we've seen it at the last conference, was their willingness to highlight the importance of the athlete's voice. And in their last conference, which was themed, The Athlete Power on the Rise. And I think engaging athletes in this discussion on governance is another sign where there really is an effort and an interest to ensure athletes are a part of the discussion. We all know that athletes have been calling for more accountability, more independence, more transparency, and increased human rights in the anti-doping movement. We all know also that athletes have the most to gain from a clean system and the most to lose from a failed system. And that's why it's inherently in their interest to be engaged and to be involved in a clean sport initiative and the governance of anti-doping. That's why I'm really pleased to have a pretty strong lineup with us today of some wonderful speakers that will guide us through their thoughts on governance and anti-doping. Before turning to them, I just thought it would be worthwhile to reflect on something that happened this week. And it was the ONDC report that came out in terms of the WADA governance. And I don't want to get into the substance of the report itself, which generally was reasoned, justified, and factual, but I want to get into the mechanisms that was used to form this report. And it was one of the areas I thought was really important was the meaningful and the open athlete engagement that the United States government had with athletes and athlete groups to discuss issues they believed was affecting athletes in the anti-doping world. The fact that they went outside just the athletes in the US and went more broadly, I think was also a sign of things people can learn moving forward. So I commend the ONDCP for doing that, and we hope moving forward that more organizations adopt a meaningful and open and an approach that engages athletes as we move forward. So as we move forward on our discussion panel, I very briefly am going to introduce our speakers we have today. I'm pleased to introduce Paulina Tomczyk, who is the Secretary General of EU Athletes. Also with us is Adam Pengilly. He's a former skeleton athlete, British skeleton. He was a member of the IOC Athlete Commission, WADA Athlete Commission or Committee, and is now the AC representative on the governance reform group of WADA. We have Emma Terho, who is a Finnish ice hockey player, 7 world time champion, 2-time Olympian bronze medal, also a member of the IOC Athlete Commission and the WADA Athlete Committee. And last but not least is Maximilian Klein, who has been leading the international strategy for the independent athlete group, Athletes Germany, that has really shown leadership in terms of what independence means and how we move forward in terms of the athlete's voice. So it's a pleasure to be joined with such a high esteemed group of athletes and athlete representatives. And I would like to now turn it over for some open remarks to Paulina on her thoughts in terms of athlete involvement and the governance of anti-doping. Paulina, over to you.
Thank you, Rob. Hi, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening. I would like to join, of course, for many thanks for the organizers, as well as everyone who has been involved in the project. We were one of the partners in the project, and I think it's really interesting to see, even if it's the preliminary results, to see the results of that long process, which I think are really, really useful for our work going forward. More specifically to this session, before I start, just for those who may not know what EU Athletes is, we are a European federation of independent athlete unions and associations from different sports and different countries in Europe. So we represent at the moment 35 organizations from 18 European countries, and wide range of different sports, mainly team sports, but also to some extent some Olympic and individual sport as well. Getting to the substance, I'm definitely really happy as well that we have an opportunity to discuss in detail the athlete involvement and engagement in anti-doping. I think it's good to see that one of the issues that the first report identifies is also the need for more formalized or institutionalized athletes involvement. Since, well, we also see that the principle reflecting to athletes involvement in the reports, it's still more red and orange than as green as we would want it to see. I think often when we think or talk about athlete involvement, we can link it to the efficiency of anti-doping. You know, if athletes understand it better, if they are involved in the process, and then they can bring the expert knowledge. But I think it's more fundamentally about the legitimacy of the whole system. If actually you're not involving your main stakeholder, how can the system really be legitimate? Secondly, it is about athletes' rights. And I think the perspective, taking it from the perspective of athletes' rights, is really helpful if we want to have more systematic and more institutionalized change. So we have to think about the right to a well-governed, free of corruption sporting environment. Of course, the freedom of association, also for athletes, and the right to organize, to be represented by the people of their own choosing, especially in the decision making on matters that affect them, which also means negotiating terms of conditions upon which they are involved in sport. And well, fundamentally, and I think that was already acknowledged in discussions yesterday, when WADA was created more than 20 years ago now, it was this famous partnership between Olympic movement and the governments without the inclusion of athletes. And actually, this exclusion of athletes continues until today. Who we have represented in the most important bodies in WADA are still governments and the Olympic movement without the athletes' representatives. When we look at the national level or sport-to-sport level, I think it's fair to say that the situations varies a lot. It would not be fair to say that there are no NADOs that engage with athletes in a meaningful way. But I think we have to also acknowledge that, first of all, the example from the top is not very positive or helpful. And on the other hand, there are limits to what can be done within the system. So the code is already there, the system is already there. There is a limited scope to what athletes can actually negotiate in a meaningful way at the national level. So from our side, EU athletes for more than 10 years now, basically from the beginning of our existence, have been advocating for not only in the area of representation and more meaningful representation than just this seat on the board, but also for a system that is fair, effective and proportionate while respecting the athletes' rights, because we know that if that's not the case, as you said, there are issues and athletes are the ones who suffer the most. So to really change, to really engage athletes in a meaningful way, I think we need to move forward quite drastically. The cosmetic changes are not enough. We have to move towards this new philosophy with athletes actually having an equal say and being able to renegotiate the system on partnership terms. Because indeed there has been more focus on athletes and more focus on athletes' rights, but I don't think the attempts that have been made always work that well. I think in some cases it has been just not enough. I think one of the big problems from our side is the refusing engagement with athletes, unions, on association or any body which is not an athletes committee. That continuous trend that sports organization or governments deciding who is an athlete's representative and with whom they engage, this is something that is of course a really big issue. I think that the famous consultation where athletes or athletes groups are being welcomed to give their feedback, but knowing that the power structure in an organization is such that in the end their voice will not be taken into account if it doesn't go to the mainstream. I think this is a very big problem, and I know that we have been in the past already making some very expert and advanced submissions that really didn't go I think anywhere far. So it's that idea that if you consult athletes and then it's okay, it's done. I think we should really move past that. Still, it's an issue with a lot of organizations still being very attached to the idea of athletes committees or commissions, and that being the only way that the athletes can be represented within organizations. And I think, well, they show, of course, quite few limits, but I would invite those organizations also to take a look at the independent report on recommendations for an IOC human rights strategy and how it points to how the IOC should review the role and the structure of its athletes commission through the lens of their responsibilities when it comes to freedom of association and freedom of to collectively bargain. Because it is important that the athletes committees do not undermine in any way the ability of athletes to join, form union or collectively bargain, and that the way that the organization engage with those athletes that have chosen to be represented through unions is also assured. I'd like to finish this short statement that is probably already too long, sorry, with just coming back to Europe, because in the end it's a project that is co-founded by the European Commission, and it's quite interesting to look back at the European Commission communication on sports from 2011 on developing the European dimension in sports, where actually the Commission was inviting the social partners and sports organizations to engage in social dialogue. And fight against doping was actually listed as one of the topics that should be addressed through that process. And I think there shouldn't be any doubt that social dialogue is a very suitable way to address difficult challenges in a way that is that works for many parties. And at the same time, it is a key component of good governance. And this is all what this project is about. So yes, thank you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Paulina. And I will not get into the habit of repeating and summarize what everyone has said, but thanks, I appreciate it. But I will follow up with some questions afterwards. Now it's a pleasure to turn the table over to and the mic over to Adam Pengilly. Adam.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, everybody, for the invite, and congratulations on this work. It's indeed timely and important. So I'll get straight to it in terms of my remarks on this point. The role of athletes in anti-doping governance was the question or title that we were posed with. I've got 3 points to make on this. One, I think, and I would argue that the title should first read Role of Athlete Representatives in Anti-Doping Governance. So when it comes to governance, it should not be about individual athletes providing their perspectives or their support or their objections. It should be about representatives advocating an informed, unbiased research position of athletes as a whole, or at least within athlete groupings. So that was my first point, athlete representatives. Secondly, and related to this is the critical point that those of you that were here yesterday would have heard David Howman raise about the importance of definitions. What is an athlete, he told us, or he asked the question. And perhaps more pertinently here, therefore, what is an athlete's representative? I think an unfortunate example of where these two issues unhelpfully intersect comes from the regular press releases from WADA, which remind us of the number of current or retired elite athletes who hold office. Now, while it's generally beneficial to have current or former athletes around the foundation board and executive committee, and a good thing, these people are not there representing athletes as a unique stakeholder group. WADA statutes and practices make it abundantly clear that these officers are there with a mandate from either the public authorities or the Olympic movement. So I'll take a stab at a couple of definitions then from my personal point of view. An athlete is anyone training or competing at elite or semi-elite level that is bound by the code. That's an athlete in the context of anti-doping. And an athlete's representative is someone who has been chosen by athletes, and athletes as defined above, to represent solely their positions in the specific context in which they're chosen. I think there is some more complexity with this. Paulina touched on it a moment ago, and this is the fact there's a difference between internal athlete bodies, such as athlete commissions, where athletes' reps are advisory to the decision-making organ, and independent athlete associations, which are subject to their athlete members and not to other stakeholders when it comes to their positions and their decision-making. I think both have a valuable role, but they need to be clearly understood as distinct and therefore have different roles. So finally, my final point is about the slightly altered question of what should be the role of athletes' representatives within anti-doping governance. And just to be slightly awkward again, I would say it does depend on the governance model. So if it's a representative governance model, sport is an example where one or more key stakeholder groups hold all the decision-making seats. Specifically, you think of international federations and also national Olympic committees. National federations, either within a country or within a sport, have the decision-making monopoly. So that's a representative governance situation. In that situation, I believe athletes' representatives should have at least equality of decision-making power with any other stakeholder. And my rationale is that the athletes are the most effective stakeholder when it comes to policy and decision-making. However, if it's a non-representative or independent governance model, such as many NADOs, and where there's no stakeholder that has a decision-making seat and the governing officers have no affiliation with them. So in this instance, I believe a formalized engagement and consultation framework needs to be established where all the key athlete groups that are bound by the code and within the NADO's jurisdiction obviously should be involved. So as such, if there are established athlete representative bodies where athletes have chosen their reps, they should be part of that engagement system, which needs to include all athlete-related policy and strategy areas. So it's a significant, for most probably nowadays, it would be a significant change in how things are worked. So I think that's enough for me from now. I'll pass back to Rob.
Thanks, Adam. A lot to think about, and I think some pretty wise way forward. And I will come back to you and question you on a few things after Emma. So Emma, the floor is yours. Again, pleasure to have you, and thanks for spending time with us. And the floor is over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. Sorry to miss partly Paulina's and Adam's opening remarks. I'm sure there were a lot of good points. And I think, so my name is, first of all, to introduce myself, I'm Emma Terho, former Finnish ice hockey player, currently in both the IOC and the WADA Athletes Commission, which I think together with my former experience in the national level athlete decision making gives a unique opportunity that I have been able to learn to understand the importance of having athlete voice being part of every single decision. I think we need different voices on different occasions, and I believe that there is practically Adam mentioned that there should be an athlete voice heard in all athlete-related policy areas. I totally agree with that, but I believe that there is practically no such area in sports where decision-making, where it's okay to exclude the athlete voice. Equally important, I think that on the athlete side, it's crucial to build relationships, networks, and a very open and ongoing decision between athletes coming from all different sports. I mean, small, big sports, amateur, professional sports, as well as different parts of the world. There are topics on which an individual athlete from a small sport knows the specific of, let's say, the doping testing of a weight class athlete, and then there are issues where the best knowledge would definitely come from a professional, from a big sport. And I think that's something that we need to make sure that we have all these different commissions, different decision-making tables where we are able to put or have an athlete that has the backing of his or her peers, that so that even either the person there sitting on the table can speak of his or her experience, or then there's a way to consult the athlete bodies or the athletes that are maybe have more knowledge on that topic. And just kind of, I think that in general it is hugely important that there's a open discussion and a way of being able to consult, and there's a existing large enough network of athletes where so we can make sure that the decisions have as much knowledge and much athlete experience from a wide range of different sports and different geographical locations and so on. I think that what is very important is that we would be able to move to a even more decision where, because obviously there are issues where even athletes themselves disagree, that we would be able to have a very open discussion between different athletes, different athlete groups, so that we could be discussing within and then bringing forward the ideas or the opinions that we have, so we can most effectively bring to the decision-making tables the view and say that this is coming from a large pool of athletes, instead of just saying that that is wrong, but we should be able to discuss in a very constructive way. And I think there we should all the time make sure that we have better ways of communicating with each other, and then make sure that in every single decision-making table there is a representation for athletes. And I think that obviously now more than ever we need to remind people the value of sports and that we are all in this together. So I think this is a time where we have a lot of opportunities to move forward and do things differently in a very constructive way.
Thank you, Emma. Appreciate it.
Maybe that's.
Maxim, over to you, my friend.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks everyone for having us and actually giving us the opportunity to join the symposium. I was really delighted actually yesterday about the results that were presented. And I think when it comes to the anti-doping governance and basically each and every decision that affect athletes indirectly or directly, it's always important to put the number one stakeholders in sport, the athletes, at the center of our attention. And when we all agree that the saying is true, nothing about us without us, we should we should place special importance to making the athlete's voice heard, especially in the world of anti-doping, where the athletes bear the costs and burdens in the fight for clean sport. And the question is, how do we represent the athletes? How do we make their voices heard? And you know, the standard model, the standard approach is the athletes commission model, and it's no surprise probably for all of you that we are heavily criticizing this this model, because we think athletes commissions internal structures basically are fundamentally and structurally flawed to or prevent athletes from independently and freely speaking up. This is why I want to give you insights from our model, the German model, and the model that has been in existence in Canada, for example, as well. In Germany, it was actually the efficiency of the global anti-doping system and the Russian doping scandal that acted as a tipping point. Athletes didn't want to feel as fig leaves anymore, and they got independent. They founded their own athletes association, and this is key for effective athlete representation. We had different phases. We had the founding phase. We fought for funding. We convinced our government to provide enough funding. We built up the association. We doubled our member base. We grew the member base. And we professionalized. We hired staff. We hired full-time staff that were able to sort of professionalize the athletes representation work. And now we are in a phase here in Germany where we are able to build up position and initiate and run long-term advocacy and lobbying efforts in the interests of the athletes, because we want to change the world of sport, and also in the sphere of anti-doping on the national level and on the international level. And I think this is very important, and this is the same basically that Adam also said. Once athletes manage to successfully organize themselves, to freely choose their own representatives, and also professionalize the work of athletes representation, meaning taking the burdens of the individual shoulders of athletes when it comes to athlete representation, and putting it on the institutional shoulders of strong and independent athletes associations. Athletes are pretty much and very successfully able to fight for their interests and make their voices heard. And that is, I think, a key insight from Germany, but I think also from all over the world. Wherever athletes are freely and independently choosing their representatives, wherever they are able to organize themselves, their representatives, their athletes associations should be acknowledged. And I think in Germany, we've been quite successful with that. We have a very well-established working relationship with our national anti-doping agency, with the NADA, and I'm totally I'm acknowledging that when it comes to the world of international anti-doping, it's pretty much more complicated. We all know the problems, and we all know the landscape. But what gives us hope is that there has been momentum in the last months. There has been momentum in the last years, and more athlete groups and their representatives are joining forces, speaking up for major reform. And I think this is key in the world of the international anti-doping system, that there is actually among athlete groups, be it vocal athlete commissions, being independent athlete associations, being the unions that've been leading the way for years, there is broad consensus among athletes and athlete groups to undergo major change of the world anti-doping system. And that gives us hope. And I think independent athlete associations should play a major role when it comes to tapping and representing the voice of the athletes.
Thanks, Max. I think you raise an interesting point, which I think I'm going to move over to Paulina for the first question. But the whole idea is what you raise is it's hard to represent athletes when you have a fiduciary duty to the organization itself. And that's a point that's been raised, recognizing that every voice is important when it comes to athletes. So it's not the athletes themselves, but it's the structures they've been put in that don't provide the freedom of expression, the freedom to speak out, like Athletes Germany has, and EU athletes, for example. Paulina, I just wanted to follow up on one thing, and we heard it yesterday from David Howman in terms of defining an athlete, and I've heard it over and over and over again. And we always have, and I've been at around the WADA table, having them try to define an athlete. And one is, should we why are sport governing organizations trying to define an athlete versus giving it to independent athlete groups like EU or World Players to actually define what athletes are under their structures and who qualifies? And with that, do you think we should be looking at the governance reforms as a defining athlete or defining athlete representation?
Thanks, Rob. I think it's a really good question. It's also Adam quite touched upon it in a very articulate way. Yeah, I think defining athlete, depending on for what purpose you're doing that, can almost become a philosophical question. At the same time, as I would quite strongly support what Adam is saying. Well, the representative, in very common understanding, is a person who is chosen or appointed to act or to speak on behalf of other person or a group of other people. So very simply, athlete representative is a person which has such a mandate from other athletes. And it's true that I think some ideas that are still circulating quite a lot in the governance are very problematic in this regard. I do hope that the topic is too fresh and there is a little bit of misunderstanding, and that it's not a cynical way to try to stop athletes from actually getting a lot of power. But of course, from this definition, it is not okay for governments or sports organization to pick who is athlete's representative. But also, it is not okay for them to put restrictions of who can represent an athlete by, saying that, for example, only a former athlete can represent athletes. This idea that somehow a former or current athlete is automatically an athlete's representative is very problematic. It's I think it should be clear to everyone. If you don't have a mandate from a bigger group of people, you're only representing your personal views. That's it. For example, in the past, I had, especially in comparison with Emma or Adam, had a very short and unsuccessful career as an athlete in judo in Poland. That does not give me the right to speak for those athletes because they didn't ask me to. But I do speak on behalf of many organizations, basketballers from France or ice hockey players from Sweden, because there is this mandate that was given for this specific purpose. So I think this is really important. But again, it goes back to respecting athletes' rights to representation and their freedom of association.
Thanks, Paulina. Adam, just to follow up on that, athletes have been very vocal, and you're sitting on the WADA governance group and governance reform. They've been very vocal, and some feel that there's been a reluctance to really embrace the independent athlete voices, where there's more comfort level in sticking with the structures that fall under the Olympic movement currently. A couple questions related to that is, do you think the independent or the broad athletes' voices are being taken seriously and listened to and given equal, if not stronger weight than stakeholders, given that anti-doping is set for them? And the second question I would have for you is, what advice would you give athletes who are demanding stronger reforms, both nationally and internationally, in order to make change?
Okay, so the first question, do I think the voice of independent athlete groups is being taken seriously in the context of the WADA governance reform working group? So within the consultation, there were offhand, I can think of 4 independent representative groups, athlete groups, who presented comments. Athletes Can from Canada, the British Athletes Commission, the Athletics Association, Track and Field Athletes, and Athleten Deutschland. There were 13 groups in total.
You had, sorry, Adam, you had Denmark, you had Norway, you had others as well.
Who are independent athlete groups. So they were from the NOCs, to Rob. So they were athlete commissions who spoke out, but independent athlete groups, I believe there were just those 4 that I mentioned. Now, are they taken any more or less seriously than the other athlete groups? I don't believe so. I think the bigger challenge is there are a variety of athlete voices, and within the governance group we had 13 that spoke out clearly, and made 2 key points really, to ask for 2 key reforms in particular, and all of them wanted significant reform at WADA. One was a lot more decision-making seats should go to athlete representatives who are independent of other stakeholders. And as I say, that was a combination of independent groups that were 4 and athlete commissions as well. Secondly, the other key thing was for more independence generally, particularly around the executive committee. It's hard to really specifically say, do I think the independent athlete voice is being taken seriously? I think those independent athlete groups who have been around a while, which I guess 2 of the main ones are the World Players Association and EU Athletes with Paulina, didn't present to the consultation, and Paulina's explained why previously, because of the frustration of actually that's not the best way to engage and involve athletes in the decision-making progress. You can't see that as just a box ticked. And I think over time, I don't want to be speaking for Paulina, so perhaps she can input, but it seemed like these 2 didn't get involved because of frustration. But as I said, the key points that athletes have said from the consultation is more representation from representatives who are independent of other stakeholders, and more independence. Is that going to be listened to? I really hope so. I'm not enormously confident, if I'm honest, but let's see. There are certainly people around our working group that are keen for that to happen. And it might depend on which member of the group that you ask as to what their view is. But I think we'll find out in a few months, because at the moment we're not at a stage of putting a lot of the detail together. It's more analysis of the feedback and bringing our own views in.
Paulina, do you want to follow up with Adam's statement in terms of
just
why?
Quickly, of course, if the name of your organization is being called, you have to clear some things. And I am also involved with World Player Association as an executive committee member, and this is the organization that represents around 80,000 of athletes who are under WADA code from around the world. So first of all, yes, we do think that to some extent the voice of such an organization should have more power than any other person who can fill in the online consultation form. But indeed, we found through time, through the consultations that have been done many years ago, that this is not the most effective and also not the most respectful, I would think, way to engage with your main constituency. I think we should focus on more meaningful engagement and actually striving to the equal say within the process. I think later, if we manage to really reform the system, consultation can still be used as a way to gather people's input, of course. But it cannot be the only one, and it cannot just mean that, well, we involved everyone because there was an open consultation. So this is the reason for which EU athletes and world players have decided not to take part in this consultation.
Rob, the second question.
Yeah,
sorry.
Go ahead, Adam. No, go ahead.
On the second question, what advice would I give? Keep going. Political change is painful and slow, and it takes time. And unfortunately, athletes' careers will go past in the time it takes for change, which is very frustrating for, I'm sure, all of us here. But just keep going, keep putting the pressure on, work together as much as we possibly can. And I think those points that I raised earlier about making sure we have what athlete representation is and is not, being clear on different roles of athlete groups, and then working hard in our various areas to make change and keep pushing those that are in a position to do so.
Thanks, Adam. Emma, I guess the follow-up on that is you're in a pretty unique position. You've worked with athletes nationally. You're an athlete yourself. You are on the IOC Athlete Commission, the WADA Athlete Committee. What do you believe athletes can and need to do to be more vocal to change the system moving forward, and to contribute both nationally and internationally to ensuring stronger reforms for athletes and athlete rights?
I think the main thing is that the athletes that are there should really use their voice, and I think it's better if we get, if you're there, you're mandated by someone, you make sure that you use the voice that you have in the different table. I think it was discussed, the athlete or the athlete representative. I think that you really need to, if you're on that table, you need to be accountable for the ones that have been mandated you to be there. And that's also referring to the independence. I mean, we should always, an athlete, when for the national or the International Federation Athlete Commission or the IOC Athletes Commission, the athletes have the aim to go there to represent athletes, and I think that's the mandate that we have, and that's what we need to keep our #1 priority in different issues that are coming. Obviously, there are cases where you need to listen to athletes from around and then finally make in the end the decision, since you have been mandated to be there. I think that, say, for instance, athlete that have become a representative in his international federation, if there's a chance the person is really enthusiastic about anti-doping issues, and if there's a chance that they would be elected to the IF board, say, I don't think that it should be something that if they decide to go to the board where they know that they can have a strong voice for the athletes, that if they do that, it should mean that they are not allowed to represent athletes in WADA anti-doping issues, since I think that we need to have a strong network so that we can have athletes in influential positions in as many places as possible. I do think that working together with the independent athlete or the athlete organizations, also like the players associations, is of course super important, since there's a lot of knowledge from team sports and from professional sports that are not in some other places.
Thank you, Emma. I'm going to give the last word to Max, but it's a question I'm going to ask you. The reality is that speaking up, fighting the system or asking to change the system, whether you're an athlete group, whether you're a NADO person, there is some type of fear of retribution that comes forward. And whether that's being told to keep things inside the tent and not go public on things and let's sort things out and there's never any change, or whether there's direct pressure put on people to remain silent and not to speak up. How has your structure, Athletes German, or has it been able to break that kind of mold of not being afraid and being able to independently speak up for the best interest of athletes? Has it made a change, and what change has that been, if it has been?
Thank you. Yeah, I think many questions, but to be like very clear and short and crisp, I think because we are structurally independent from our NOC and financially independent from our NOC, we are able to freely and independently and strongly speak up for the interests of the athletes. I think this is very important because there were initial discussions to keep sort of all the funding within the NOC and to be within the structure, but you always run into the risk that there are conflicts of interest, that the interests of the athletes are not 100% aligned with the institutions, with the sport governing bodies, or with the World Anti-Doping Agency, for example. So therefore, it is key to have a structurally and financially independent organization that is able to tap the voice of the athletes and sort of represent their interests. But it's not only about independence. I think independence is a key factor, but there are three other important aspects, because what I think sort of added to our success in Germany. We got independent first. Secondly, you need to be a legitimate or representative of the athletes. That was discussed before. It's not about being an athlete or being a former athlete. You must be good at representing the athletes, and there must be a direct or indirect chain of democratic legitimacy. Once this is achieved, independence and legitimacy, the athletes associations and we have to be acknowledged as legitimate representatives of the athlete's voice. And I think the third factor, and that this is key, you need to professionalize. There needs to be enough funding, and there needs to be full-time staff that is able to sort of take the conflict from the individual shoulders, from the athletes, what I said before, and shift it to the institutional shoulders, so that an organization is actually able to run like long-term advocacy efforts, long-term lobbying efforts in the interests of the athletes, be it on a national level or the international level. And to give like one example, and I can't prove the counterfactual, but when we're talking about independent oversight structures, and I think the anti-doping system is nothing else. It's about independent oversight. It's about the dispersion of power in the system. We recently in Germany lobbied and advocated for an independent center for safe sport. It's a different topic than anti-doping, but even in the fields of abuse and violence of sport, we see the need for independent oversight structures. And I think a dependent athlete organization like an athlete commission in Germany would never have been able to publish a paper calling for independent oversight structures over their own NOC. And now we as an independent and full-time and an organization with full-time staff and financially well-equipped, we're able to release this paper and actually strongly calling for such a center, and now undergoing a long-term lobbying effort in Germany that will take years. And that would have never been possible within the structures of the NOC or within the structures of the athlete commission model, to answer your question.
Thanks, Max. And before I turn it over to Jens, I want to thank Paulina, Max, Adam, and Emma for your insight. And I think just some closing words as I opened up with is athletes have the most to gain from a clean sports system and one that works well, and they have the most to lose when it's not working well. And that's where both national anti-doping organizations and WADA and international federations, the IOC, anyone involved in governance of anti-doping, your strongest advocates are the athletes. And if you take time to listen, to engage, and make them equal partners, I think moving forward, as was said by all of our panelists, that will enhance the system, will build more credibility in the system, and you'll have your biggest advocates supporting the system. And until that happens, we'll be continuing spinning around in the same circles with athletes demanding change. So I encourage everyone to yield the advice from Paulina, Max, Adam, and Emma, and bring athletes to the table meaningfully in a way that is about reform and the best interest of athletes. And I want to thank again Jens, Play the Game, Athletes Germany, and NADO for hosting and allowing the athletes a prominent voice first thing on a Wednesday afternoon / morning for some. And thanks for joining us.
Well, I'd like to add my thanks to the whole panel, to Paulina, Maximilian, Emma, Adam, and Rob. I think this discussion testifies to how important the athlete movement has become. It's much more diverse than 10 years ago. It has a much higher quality than 10 years ago. And it's a very important addition to the sports democracy, the association-based sports democracy that should work perfectly, but still has some way to go before we can say that the sports federations represents ideal ways of practicing democracy. Certainly, athletes are part of the progress, and it was a pleasure that you were part of this discussion. Your experiences will be a part of the report, the final report we make of this National Anti-Doping Governance Observer Project, and thank you. Now it's time for a little break, and I kindly ask all attendees and speakers, if you wish to continue here, not to switch off your computer and the connection to the symposium during the break, but simply go and take the coffee or tea, whatever you enjoy, a glass of water, and we will meet here again for an interesting discussion about WADA governance reform in 10 minutes exactly at 3:10 Central European summertime. Whatever time it is, it's 10 minutes is the same everywhere in the world. See you in 10 minutes.